great pleasure for me to join you, and I start by thanking the United Nations System Staff College for bringing us together, for providing us with the platform, and also for these excellent tools that allow us to work in multiple languages. And we look forward to working with everyone who's on the call today, and not to hesitate. If there are challenges or questions, please raise them. You can raise them in the chat, or you can just raise your hand and we will try to address them. For those who don't know me, I am Jean-Paul Adam, and I'm the Director for Policy Monitoring and Advocacy at the Office of the Special Advisor on Africa, and I will be moderating today's discussion. Today we will be talking about leveraging homegrown school feeding programs as macroeconomic policy tools for Africa's sustainable development. This is the final webinar in OSAA's online course around the Peace and Development Nexus in Africa: governance, financing, and country systems. Today's session about leveraging homegrown school feeding programs will really focus on how we can implement these programs integrated into national development strategies to address critical challenges in education, health, agriculture, and energy. I think we will have seen already so far in the course that in many cases, the security challenges in the continent are due to the absence of the state, the inability of the state to intervene, to support populations, and therefore also for populations to see what value state authorities can bring. Homegrown school feeding programs are a way in which, even in the most fragile situations, support can be brought to communities in a very meaningful way, because it addresses interrelated issues, including the access to education, including, for example, access to education for girls who are often marginalized in many of these conflicted situations. There is also the opportunity to address issues around nutrition, and as well as a means of creating stability in regions where often this is one of the main concerns faced by populations. So therefore, homegrown school feeding programs are not just about providing meals to school children. They can also drive economic growth, improve education and health outcomes, promote climate adaptation, and support local food systems. And one of the things that we want to hear about in today's webinar is how using homegrown school feeding programs can anchor, for example, the development of value chains for local agriculture. And I would like to share with you that I participated last week in a meeting of the community of Portuguese-speaking countries, which was held in Sao Tome and Principe, where there were many examples of how local procurement was used to actually create anchor financing for smallholder farmers producing for school feeding programs. And the idea is that we can further expand these types of programs, including providing climate resilience by, for example, linking to renewable energy sources, solar panels, for example, on schools, as well as renewable energy available for local farmers. And we have seen in countries like Brazil how this has become a program which is worth multi-millions of dollars, but which also is a critical component of their domestic agricultural strategy and a crucial part of their economy, showing how social goals and can be accompanied by programs that actually build economic value chains that can support the overall attainment of the Sustainable Development Goals. In addition to exploring how we can tackle education, health, energy, and agriculture simultaneously, we can also reflect on the role of digital public infrastructure in enhancing the effectiveness and efficiency of homegrown school feeding programs. And this, for example, means the way in which we can use digital technologies to improve the data that is available for decision-making around such programs, but also how technologies like artificial intelligence can support, for example, the development of the agricultural sector in these environments and provide the right framework for homegrown school feeding programs. And we also want to reflect on the role of homegrown school feeding programs to support peace building, climate adaptation, and as I've already mentioned, as an anchor for food systems transformation. Now, just to remind you on the format for our discussions, we will start with a panel which will cover the first hour of our discussions. And the second hour will allow us to exchange with the panelists and to also hear from participants. I encourage everyone to share their questions in advance. When we are speaking in the panel, please feel free to put your questions in the chat. This actually helps us in terms of improving the interaction among the panelists, but also to allow a real-time engagement with the core issues. So please do not wait till the end to add your questions. Please go ahead and do so in the chat. And please feel free as well in the part of our discussion that is available for interaction to raise your hands, and we can also give you the floor. I would also like to remind us, if you have joined a little bit late, that we have one panelist who will be speaking in French. And I would like to remind everyone that you can set your simultaneous interpretation language in the Zoom settings captions to receive it in English or in French. Alors, je vous rappelle qu'aujourd'hui, nous allons avoir une partie de notre conversation qui sera en français. Alors, n'hésitez pas de sélectionner la langue qui vous convienne, soit l'anglais ou bien le français, sous la rubrique Captions dans l'outil de Zoom et qui vous permet d'avoir en simultané une interprétation en forme textuelle. I would now like to introduce our panelists, and we are joined by Mr. Maxime Dahoun. Dr. Dahoun is a sociologist and consultant with extensive experience in development project management, especially in school meal programs across Africa. And his insights from countries like Benin and Rwanda will shed light on the opportunities and challenges in scaling up homegrown school feeding programs. Dr. Dahoun est un expert et nous avons le plaisir de l'avoir avec nous. Et merci de partager avec nous, Dr. Dahoun. We are also joined by Eduardo Tancioni, who is a policy specialist at the United Nations Capital Development Fund. And he has provided strategic policy advice in the areas of sustainable finance and local producer support, including work on school meals in Benin, as well as renewable energy linked to food production in Rwanda and Kenya. And his experience in integrating sustainable financing with development projects will inform today's discussion. And as always, throughout the course, we always need to be thinking about the methodologies for raising financing and also integrating this within domestic resource mobilization. And our third panelist is Ms. Karen Ologudu, and she's a senior school meals advisor at the World Food Programme's Regional Office for Western Africa. And her work has included linking local agriculture with school feeding programs, and her expertise in designing and implementing such strategies as integrated development solutions will be central to our discussion of homegrown school feeding programs' impact. I think Karen has not yet joined us, so we will start with our other panelists, and hopefully she will be able to join us a little bit later. She was with me last week in Sao Tome at the conference on homegrown school feeding in Portuguese-speaking countries. So hopefully we will be able to hear from her to share her experiences. In the absence of Karen, I will start our discussion with Dr. Dahoun. Dr. Dahoun, merci beaucoup d'être avec nous. Et je sais que vous avez un parcours très intéressant qui a couvert plusieurs pays, inclus le Bénin, le Rwanda et bien d'autres. Je voudrais que vous partagez avec nous, selon vos expériences, comment est-ce que les programmes pour l'alimentation scolaire, comment ces programmes ont pu contribuer à bâtir la résilience dans des communautés ruraux, surtout à travers le développement de l'agriculture locale. Merci de partager avec nous vos idées et on fera la suite avec quelques autres questions. À vous la parole, Dr. Dahoun.
Merci Jean-Paul. Merci à tous. Alors, comment tirer parti des programmes d'alimentation scolaire à base de produits locaux comme outil de politique macroéconomique pour le développement durable de l'Afrique? C'est autour de ce thème que nous allons échanger et mon propos sera articulé en 4 grandes parties. En première partie, je parlerai de l'intégration des politiques et de l'impact multisectoriel de l'alimentation scolaire. Dans une deuxième partie, je parlerai de la gouvernance inclusive et de la présence de l'État à travers l'alimentation scolaire. Et en troisième partie, je parlerai des problèmes d'énergie et d'adaptation au climat. Et ensuite, je montrerai comment la croissance économique et la résilience peuvent s'obtenir à travers l'alimentation scolaire. Lorsqu'on parle d'alimentation scolaire, beaucoup pensent qu'il s'agit d'une opération ponctuelle qui consiste juste à acquérir des intrants, à faire des préparations et à mettre à disposition les repas. Alors, l'alimentation scolaire cache une réalité beaucoup plus complexe. Il s'agit d'un processus rationnel qui, en amont comme en aval du repas servi aux enfants, impacte significativement les acteurs directs et indirects de la chaîne, ainsi que les divers acteurs sollicités. À ce titre, les expériences vécues dans ce domaine doivent être capitalisées et modélisées pour servir aux communautés et aux acteurs méso et macro comme un schéma de développement économique et social, inclusif, maîtrisé et partagé. Alors, je voudrais à ce titre partager avec vous quelques éléments de la chaîne, parce que quand on parle d'alimentation scolaire, on pense juste qu'il faut juste aller acheter les intrants, préparer et servir les enfants. Non, je disais tantôt que c'est une chaîne de fait. Alors, la première chaîne, le premier élément de la chaîne que je voudrais échanger avec vous, ce sont les infrastructures dans les écoles. L'alimentation scolaire a induit la mise en place dans les écoles d'infrastructures ayant facilité l'opérationnalisation des cantines. Il s'agit par exemple des cuisines, des foyers améliorés, des magasins pour pouvoir entreposer les vivres, de réfectoires, de puits, de forages, de latrines, de construction de clôtures pour l'école, d'espace pour le jardin. Alors, la grande majorité des écoles au Bénin ne disposent pas de ces infrastructures. Donc, au lancement du programme, il était évident quand même qu'il faudrait prévoir ces infrastructures, notamment les points d'eau. Donc, des écoles ont fait des plaidoyers pour avoir l'appui des partenaires qui ont pu creuser certains puits, construire des latrines, faire des clôtures et essayer de renforcer des capacités quand même pour qu'il y ait des jardins. Parce qu'il y a eu des écoles qui ont eu des jardins pour pouvoir avoir quelques légumes en complément aux aliments. Alors, toutes ces infrastructures ont été construites grâce à l'introduction de l'alimentation scolaire. Une seconde chaîne que je voudrais échanger et que je voudrais partager avec vous, c'est les foyers améliorés. Alors, les renforcements de capacité dans les écoles ont permis d'installer des foyers améliorés dans la plupart des écoles. Ces foyers sont disposés de telle sorte que les fagots de bois sont introduits de l'extérieur de la cuisine. Cela rend possible la cuisson à l'air libre et réduit l'incendie. Ces foyers sont conçus de façon à réduire la consommation de l'énergie. Je ne sais pas si Christian peut partager le PowerPoint pour montrer l'image du foyer pour que je le commente. Ou Alexandro, est-ce que vous pouvez défiler l'image ou bien
Je vais voir avec le secrétariat qu'il puisse le faire.
D'accord.
Mais en attendant, si vous pouvez aller de l'avant.
Je peux continuer, voilà.
Ouais.
Voilà. Donc, comme je le disais, il y a les foyers améliorés. Donc, il y a, en fait, dans le slide, il y a une image de ce foyer que je voudrais commenter. Bon. En dehors des foyers améliorés, il y a les points d'approvisionnement en eau potable. Donc, la disponibilité d'eau potable dans les écoles est un véritable problème. Seulement quelques écoles en disposent. Alors, dans la généralisation des cantines scolaires, certains partenaires du PAM, certains agents des Nations Unies ont offert des fourrages dans des écoles. Malgré cela, c'est un petit nombre d'écoles qui disposent d'eau. Malgré cela, c'est un véritable problème d'avoir accès à l'eau. Mais grâce à l'alimentation scolaire, les communautés ont pris conscience de cela et il y a certaines mairies ou certaines bonnes volontés qui sont disposées à offrir dans des écoles des fourrages d'eau. Il y a le dispositif de lavage des mains, parce que l'introduction de l'alimentation scolaire s'est accompagnée de sensibilisation en matière d'hygiène et d'assainissement au sein des écoles. Alors, ceci a conduit à mettre systématiquement en place des dispositifs de lavage de mains fabriqués avec des bidons d'huile recyclés et la corde des tiges et des bois. Bon, il y a aussi une image, par cela, on pourra peut-être le projeter après pour que je commente cette image-là. Donc, ce sont les ONG partenaires du PAM qui appuient les écoles à mettre en place ces dispositifs dont la fabrication est souvent l'occasion d'apprentissage pour les élèves. Les techniques de fabrication de ces dispositifs sont souvent acquises par les écoliers. Certains ont même fabriqué ces dispositifs dans leur domicile pour l'utiliser. Il convient de mener des études plus fines pour évaluer l'impact pédagogique et social de l'arrivée de l'eau et de ces dispositifs qui sont dans les écoles. Nous avons les cuisinières qui sont un maillon de la chaîne. Les cuisinières sont les principales actrices des cantines scolaires. Elles y jouent un rôle de premier plan et sont en contact direct avec les directeurs d'école, les parents d'élèves et les élèves. Elles sont recrutées sur la base du bénévolat et sont formées sur les thèmes suivants: la démonstration culinaire, les notions de base sur la nutrition et l'hygiène, les bonnes pratiques autour de la préparation des repas, le suivi nutritionnel des enfants. Ces apprentissages constituent un investissement stratégique au service de la durabilité, car la plupart des cuisinières répliquent les bonnes pratiques apprises dans leur maison et dans leur communauté. Ainsi recrutées pour de simples préparations de repas, elles repartent avec des connaissances qu'ils appliquent, avec des règles d'économie, d'énergie, d'hygiène et de gestion des vivres. Il faut dire que l'alimentation scolaire a favorisé aussi l'amélioration de la santé des écoliers. Le problème d'alimentation scolaire a impliqué le ministère de la Santé dans le dispositif. Alors, il y a dans les écoles des prises de poids réguliers et les mesures de taille des enfants. Et chaque écolier dispose d'une fiche sur laquelle est inscrit ses données de santé. Cette implication du ministère de la Santé a permis de démasquer des enfants malnutris qui ont bénéficié d'un suivi régulier. Toutes les cuisinières bénéficiaient de visites médicales garantissant ainsi la santé des élèves et des cuisinières. Le ministère de la Santé est également impliqué dans la formation des cuisinières, la définition des menus, le repas et dans la recherche de solutions pour l'approvisionnement en eau potable. L'alimentation scolaire permet aussi la promotion de l'égalité des sexes. Alors, les évaluations des programmes de cantines scolaires ont montré l'effet positif des cantines scolaires sur l'amélioration des inscriptions des filles et des garçons dans les écoles, ainsi que sur la rétention des filles et des garçons dans les écoles. Du fait de l'alimentation scolaire, la plupart des élèves ne rentrent plus à midi ce qui réduit les errances des écoliers qui parfois ne reviennent pas l'après-midi faute d'avoir mangé. De ce fait, le taux de grossesse précoce a chuté. Aussi, on remarque la réduction des mariages forcés. Les enfants déscolarisés constituent une charge pour leurs parents qui sont obligés de les amener au champ ou au marché, ne pouvant pas les laisser seuls à la maison. Et avec l'alimentation scolaire, les parents sont beaucoup plus libres, ils économisent beaucoup de temps et arrivent même à économiser de l'argent parce qu'ils ne sont plus obligés de prévoir le repas de midi à leurs enfants. Avec l'avènement des cantines, il faut signaler qu'il y a l'abandon. L'avènement des cantines, des abandons sont rares. Ceci est une influence de la scolarisation des filles. L'amélioration des techniques culturelles des producteurs. Le PAM a procédé au renforcement de capacités des petits producteurs en vue de garantir la qualité de leur production et avoir des productions répondant aux normes de qualité exigées. Ces producteurs ont pu vendre leur production à des prix qu'ils jugent nettement supérieurs à ceux jugés jusque-là pratiqués. Des coopératives de producteurs et des producteurs ont été formées. Les capacités de ces derniers sont renforcées en matière de techniques agricoles et de stockage des récoltes. Au total, on peut dire que la mise en place des systèmes d'alimentation scolaire efficaces nécessite la synergie de plusieurs secteurs. Et c'est ce que le gouvernement béninois a compris en adoptant un modèle d'alimentation scolaire intersectoriel spécifiquement adapté au Bénin. Ce modèle est placé sous la responsabilité du ministère des Finances en collaboration avec le PAM. Et il comprend 6 piliers. Je ne sais pas si la technique, il y a un slide que je voudrais commenter par rapport à ces 6 piliers. Bon, c'est pas grave. Bon, les 6 piliers, c'est 6 ministères sectoriels qui sont impliqués intimement dans les cantines scolaires. Nous avons le ministère des Affaires sociales qui sensibilise les populations sur les mesures d'hygiène. Nous avons le ministère de la décentralisation et de la gouvernance locale qui est ensemble avec le ministère de l'enseignement maternel et de base qui s'occupe des infrastructures et des équipements. Le ministère de l'Agriculture qui s'occupe des acquisitions, des achats des vivres et de la conversion progressive des producteurs locaux. Et on a le ministère de la Santé qui s'occupe du déparasitage des enfants et du suivi médical des enfants. Le ministère des Finances qui coordonne et mobilise les ressources financières. Et enfin, la présidente de la République qui est la cellule de suivi du bon fonctionnement des cantines scolaires. Donc, le modèle béninois est un modèle qui repose sur ces 6 piliers et ce modèle est en construction parce qu'il faut dire que tous ces ministères sont impliqués dans la cantine scolaire et chaque ministère joue son rôle de façon à ce qu'ils mettent ensemble la synergie et qu'ils voient en même temps les parts de ces ministères qui doivent entrer en jeu pour le bon fonctionnement des cantines scolaires. Donc, il va de soi que l'alignement d'un tel modèle sur les priorités nationales ne devrait pas poser de problème. De la même manière, il serait très facile d'aligner ce modèle sur les ODD parce que déjà au départ, les cantines scolaires ne vont pas en vase clos. Ils sont impliqués directement avec les différents ministères sectoriels, ce qui fait que l'alignement avec les ODD et l'alignement avec les priorités nationales ne pose absolument aucun problème. Alors, les cantines scolaires constituent ainsi un outil essentiel pour faire progresser le développement à long terme et l'école, puis des communautés. C'est un levier sur lequel le développement économique et social des communautés peut être bâti.
Merci, Dr. Daroun. Vous avez terminé?
Non, non, il reste quelques...
Pardon. Si vous pouvez, peut-être dans une ou 2 minutes, parce qu'on
Oui,
a quelques soucis de temps. Merci.
d'accord, entendu. Le programme d'alimentation scolaire basé sur les produits locaux, s'ils sont bien structurés et coordonnés, rendent possible l'inclusive. Parce qu'il faut absolument un leadership. Le leadership doit être placé le plus haut possible pour rassurer l'inclusivité de l'État et la présence de l'État. Il faut forcément un cadre juridique, parce qu'il faut la loi, il faut une loi sur l'alimentation scolaire basée sur les produits locaux, un budget national conséquent, des budgets municipaux, parce qu'il faudrait aussi sensibiliser les maires pour qu'au niveau de chaque mairie, il y ait des ressources pour les infrastructures et contribuer peu à peu à construire dans les écoles les infrastructures. Et il y a l'épineux problème aussi des cuisinières, c'est-à-dire que la prise en charge des cuisinières, qui est un véritable problème. Il faut dire aussi que le problème de l'énergie se pose, parce que dans la plupart des écoles, les repas sont préparés au feu de bois. Chaque écolier vient avec des fagots de bois une fois par semaine. Il y a quand même quelques expériences de biogaz qu'on a pu remarquer, mais qui n'ont pas été concluantes parce qu'il n'y a pas de le biodigesteur. C'est-à-dire qu'il n'y a pas suffisamment de biomasse pour pouvoir alimenter les biodigesteurs, ce qui empêche l'utilisation de ces dispositifs qui ont été mis en place. Alors, au total, nous pouvons retenir que l'alimentation scolaire basée sur les produits locaux a un effet positif sur la consommation locale, la réduction des conflits. Je vous remercie.
Merci, pardon, Dr. Daoun, j'ai pris un moment juste à activer mon micro. Merci pour cette brillante présentation. Et nous allons aussi partager avec les participants les présentations que vous avez faites. Et vous avez très bien, je crois, tissé les liens entre les différentes interventions qui permet en fait une cohérence entre les objectifs du développement durable dans le profil d'un pays et même des pays peut-être qui ont des ressources limitées. Et vous avez aussi bien, je crois, expliqué la structure de gouvernance politique qui permet, comment dire en anglais, le ownership de ces programmes, qui est très important. Et je vais revenir vers vous après. Je vais d'abord questionner Eduardo, mais je reviendrai vers vous pour parler un petit peu plus sur ces questions de cohérence politique. Et je note aussi la question dans le chat par Pezu Mukwakwa sur la question de financement et d'appropriation locale et aussi les défis pour les extensions des programmes. Parce que comme vous avez cité, souvent ces programmes sont développés avec le soutien du Programme alimentaire mondial, le PAM, en anglais WFP, et comment les pérenniser dans un contexte local. Alors, je reviendrai vers vous après, mais d'abord de passer à Eduardo. Eduardo, I'm going to come to you now, and thank you for your patience, and we appreciate very much your engagement on this very important subject. And can you tell us a little bit more about the sustainable financing mechanisms that UNCDF has supported setting up in Benin? And are there any lessons that can already be learned from this approach that may be relevant to other countries? Thank you for sharing any thoughts on these examples with us.
Thank you, Jean-Paul, and thank you everyone for having me today. I'm very excited to be sharing some lessons learned on the importance of sustainable finance. And I think I see also already on the chat that, when talking about homegrown school feeding, we need to think about sustainability when it comes to how we're going to finance it. And in order to do so, we need to think more than the public sector. We need to think about how we can boost the participation of the private sector. And as UNCDF, we are, for those who don't know, we are a fund within the United Nations that is basically tailored to providing de-risking mechanisms to boost private sector participation, as well as to ensure that there's affordable financing is available to the last mile communities, to last mile MSMEs. So I think when talking about financing, especially in this context, when it comes to smallholder farmers that are to give the produce to sustain the homegrown school feeding programs, there are some constraints that come into mind. The first one is accessibility, because smallholder farmers, cooperatives, as well as agri-MSMEs, sometimes, actually most of the times, kind of fall into what we call the missing middle trap, which basically means that, the financing needs are above and beyond what's available and what could be sustained by microfinance institutions, yet too small to be sustained by larger financial institutions, including development finance institutions or multilateral development banks. And, this is particularly relevant because local financial institutions do not normally see agriculture as an attractive sector, because of the inherent nature of agriculture being, and the nature of smallholder farmers, especially in those contexts where that we're talking about today, because most of the cooperatives look into self-sustenance production, as well as very low yields, and they need access to affordable capital that will help them to grow their business, not only to meet the demands of schools, which are a stable market within the homegrown school feeding programs, but in general to the market itself. So when it comes to that, not only is the perception that we need to look into, but also the need to develop some specialized financing products that could meet the demands and the specificities that smallholder farmers may have. And a particular element, especially here, when we talk about homegrown school feeding programs, is the localization of, smallholder farmers. Normally they are in very rural areas, they're very remote areas, and local financial institutions may not have that presence. They do not know the market. They do not know that, they are very bankable. They have bankable opportunities within themselves. So we really need to think about ways not only to demonstrate the bankability of, smallholder farmers and their work, but also to ensure that, they have access to those tailored financial products that meet the demands. This is one aspect. On the other hand, when, sustainable financing products may be available, they're simply not affordable, because, the requirements that local financial institutions bear onto smallholder farmers are simply not attainable, because they propose very high prohibitive interest rates in the double digits. They require high collateral at 130, 150% compared to the loan structure. And also the loans, the minimum loans sizing that they may propose are just too big to meet the demands of what the smallholder farmers actually need at that particular time. And another element that we need to think about is the cultural aspect. Because, when talking to smallholder farmers, they're a bit hesitant to loans, to just simply, to take on loans or have other financial exposures. So I think, linking it to, the multifaceted approach and the multisectorality of homegrown school feeding, it's also important to bear and to introduce financial literacy across those actors within the value chain of homegrown school feeding, so that they can see the value of, additional and more affordable financing options that are available to them. So for us as UNCDF, we really wanted to see how can we support this multisectoral program. like homegrown school feeding. And in order to, we really wanted to leverage not only the opportunity and the possibility for us to provide a lending directly through our own balance sheet, but also the fact that we are part of the UN system. So really, how can we link the expertise from a development and peace standpoint that WFP may have with the financing capabilities that we have at our disposal. And what we did is actually, interestingly enough, is in Benin, and we worked on the Programme National l'Alimentaire Scolaire, the PNASI. And what we did was, maybe I will share my screen so that I can show with participants. If I can share 1 second. I can do so. Okay, if you can see my screen.
We can see your screen, but it's not the slide. I think, yeah, it's coming. There we are. Very good.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so if you see, like, what we did was really, how do we work with, how do we boost market development? How do we ensure, how do we unlock domestic capital and, build local financial ecosystems? In order to do so, we need to work with players, and we need to incentivize local players and local financial institutions to give it a chance, to demonstrate that, the work that MSMEs, smallholder farmers do, is bankable. And what we did was we worked and we looked into a local financial institution called Alide, and we provided them a guarantee for them to on-lend to smallholder farmers. So basically, we need to, given that, as I said before, local financial institutions really have a high perceived risk when it comes to agriculture and smallholder farmers, we needed to tackle that. We needed to, absorb that risk. And UNCDF is best positioned to do so, especially in those markets, because we are a non-credit rated agency. So our appetite for risk is quite high compared to other similar partners. So what we did was we provided a 70% coverage guarantee to Alide to on-lend to smallholder farmers so that they could have, the risk-tolerant capital to boost their production to meet the demands on the homegrown school feeding. And we didn't do it alone. We ensured that, it's not only financing that comes into play, but we also ensured that not only comes into play and is available to smallholder farmers, but also the technical assistance, the capacity is available. So that's why we partner with the World Food Programme to ensure that there's a multifaceted support to those smallholder farmers. And of course, the produce that smallholder farmers would give is then supplied to the WFP that would help with the storage as well as the distribution to various schools. And these proved to be quite successful because the importance here is not only to provide the risk coverage, because when we talk about smallholder farmers, they do not have the collateral most of the times that is required and by traditional local finance institutions and financiers. So really, this is the guarantee that we provided, served as an incentive to provide this on lending, and served as an incentive to cover at 70% the risk that Alide may have endured, given the on lending to smallholder farmers. And
Eduardo, just to pause you a second, because it has been flagged to me, so I can see your presentation actually quite well, but apparently it is not in presentation mode, and this means that in the recording it will not feature. So if you could put it in presentation mode.
I have it I have it in presentation mode in my.
For some reason on our screens, it appears smaller. I could read it. I mean, it was not a problem for me to follow.
Sorry, let me try and do.
Yes.
Yeah.
It was not a problem for me to follow. And I think the majority of people are actually following. But because we record this and we want to use it again, we want to make sure that people can see the screen.
Yeah. So, yeah, let me see. I don't know if Christian maybe can help. It's the same slide that I shared earlier. But yeah, I'm closing up right now. So I will share it so that maybe it's available for, participants.
Yes,
going
yes,
forward.
that would be great. Please carry on.
So yeah, that's it's important not only to provide this kind of guarantee, but also to incentivize, to have this kind of dialogue with local financial institutions to see the bankability of the work that smallholder farmers and agri-MSMEs do. So it's important also to see, to define those terms for this on-lending that we have incentivized, because it's still, you cannot stay at the same level as you would have within the finance spectrum for larger and more stable and more established enterprises. So this is a step that this is an approach that we think could help boost local financial ecosystems, but also trying to see how can we define ways, working with partners, working with national governments, working with civil society organizations, and all of the different players that come into play and actors within the value chain, homegrown school feeding. How can we define more sustainable financing opportunities that mobilize private capital? So that's my take.
Thank you so much, Eduardo. And I think that you've given a very concrete example of how the UN CDF plays a role of de-risking in the context of you have these programs that are providing essentially a base requirement in terms of financing. So if a government is providing school feeding programs and they are doing this procurement for local farmers, this can be a way of incentivizing lending to those small farmers. And those small farmers can, again, if we look at the value chain, I think you did not say this explicitly, but I read into what you said, they are de-risked because they have the assurance of that contract, and they are able to access finance that they previously were not able to. And in addition, this means that they can also produce more, not only for the school feeding, but more generally in terms of food security for their community and for their region, which then creates value added throughout. And you've also emphasized the policy aspects of de-risking, which are very important because any program value chain has to fit in, the policies have to be interlinked. And I think we've heard this from Dr. Dahoun as well. You need that strong coherence from a public health perspective, for example, in terms of nutrition, as well as the coherence with the agricultural strategy, which prioritize empowering smallholder farmers. And if I'm not mistaken, 70% of Africans involved in agriculture are smallholder farmers. And it's about empowering that group of citizens across the continent and linking that with a social good, a program which has huge impact in terms of achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, and using the interventions such as through the UN CDF to de-risk this group that normally does not have access to finance, which then creates a opportunity to further scale up finance in other ways. Thank you so much. Je reviens vers vous, Dr. Dahoun, pour la suite. Et je crois que une des questions, c'est justement, vous avez parlé un peu de la cohérence politique. Et dans nos webinaires précédents que nous avons faits, nous avons discuté en profondeur la cohésion des politiques verticales et horizontales, de faire le lien entre les différents programmes. Et dans votre parcours et aussi selon ce que vous avez vu, quels sont les défis que les pays rencontrent lors de la conception des programmes pour l'alimentation scolaire, et comment assurer la pérennisation de ces programmes, et comment surmonter les défis, je dirais surtout au point de départ, parce que comme vous avez dit, il faut un budget conséquent. Je crois que vous avez bien utilisé ces termes. Et souvent, on peut démarrer avec le soutien des agences comme le Programme alimentaire mondial, mais après, comment pérenniser? Et il y a des questions de Pezu Mukwakwa dans le chat. C'est à quelle mesure sont-ils durables en termes de ce financement? À vous la parole, peut-être pour 5 minutes. Merci. Il me semble que qu'on a un problème de connexion pour Dr. Dahoun.
Connexion, voilà. J'ai un problème de connexion. Oui, bon, je n'ai pas écouté, je n'ai pas entendu la dernière phrase. Allô?
Maintenant,
Vous
on vous
m'entendez?
entend. Maintenant, c'est bon. Pendant un petit moment, ça ne marchait pas, mais là, ça va
Coupé.
très bien.
Oui, ben, comme je vous le disais, le grand problème qui se pose dans les différents États, c'est d'abord le leadership. Parce que, par exemple, au Bénin, on a la chance au Bénin, et le chef de l'État lui-même a pris le devant des choses. Il arrive couramment qu'il appelle le programme ou même qu'il appelle le PAM pour leur demander de venir le faire le point dans son bureau. Comment ça avance? Donc, si les autres pays peuvent avoir cette chance qu'il y ait un leadership très élevé, on ne dit pas forcément au niveau de la présidence partout, même si on demande à un ministre et qu'il a les coudées franches, ça peut permettre d'aller. Et comme je l'ai dit, il faut forcément un cadre juridique parce qu'il faut encadrer cela avec des lois et des degrés d'application pour que chacun sache. Et il faudrait inscrire un budget dans le budget global de l'État pour appuyer pour appuyer cela. Bon, comme le disait tout à l'heure Eduardo, il faut voir dans quelle mesure on peut impliquer le secteur privé pour le financement de l'alimentation scolaire. Mais dans le modèle béninois, l'État met à disposition les grosses dépenses et on laisse les communautés se débrouiller par rapport aux petites dépenses. C'est déjà une solution. Parce que, par exemple, si au moment où l'État a dit qu'il veut passer à 75% ou à 100%, si on devait attendre de disposer les points d'eau dans les écoles, de construire les cuisines et d'avoir tout prêt, on ne peut pas avancer. Donc, le PAM a commencé comme ça. Et donc, il y a des écoles aujourd'hui dans lesquelles vous n'avez pas de point d'eau, vous n'avez pas de cuisine, mais les populations ont mis en place des structures éphémères qui permettent déjà quand même de donner à manger aux enfants tous les midis. Donc, voilà, par exemple, des cas de résilience où on voit qu'avec peu de moyens, les gens travaillent quand même. Donc, la question du financement et de l'autonomisation du financement reste un problème entier. Parce que même au Bénin, comme je vous l'ai dit, le gouvernement finance les grosses dépenses, mais l'argent pour acheter les condiments, c'est les communautés qui donnent 25 francs par élève pour acheter cela. Sur ce plan, à peine 40% donnent l'argent. Mais sur la base des 40% qui donnent l'argent, tout le monde mange à midi. Et donc, la conscientisation et la sensibilisation continuent avec les ONG pour que les parents d'élèves comprennent l'importance de participer à cela. Il faut dire aussi qu'il y a eu des sensibilisations au niveau des mairies pour que la mairie aussi s'implique. Et toutes les entreprises qui sont dans les communautés aussi sont sensibilisées pour voir dans quelle mesure ils peuvent aider, soit à construire un puits, soit à faire la clôture de l'école pour éviter la divagation des animaux, et donc, etc. Donc, il y a quand même beaucoup d'initiatives qui se prennent pour l'autonomisation de la cantine scolaire. C'est vrai, avec toutes les dépenses qui sont mises sur la table au Bénin, par exemple, ça ne couvre pas tous les besoins. Aujourd'hui, nous sommes à 75% des écoles. Dans beaucoup d'écoles, quand vous voyez, il y a encore beaucoup de manques, mais à cause des petits points lumineux de réussite, on peut avoir l'espoir que ça va marcher.
Merci beaucoup, Dr. Dahoun. Et vous avez bien expliqué les défis. Je pense qu'il y a vous avez cité l'exemple du Bénin où le programme marche très bien, mais ce n'est pas peut-être à l'ampleur qu'on aurait souhaité s'il y avait tout le budget nécessaire. La contribution des élèves, la contribution des familles est très importante. Mais peut-être c'est aussi une question de trouver les moyens à mobiliser davantage d'argent à travers le budget national qui permet justement à augmenter à améliorer l'échelle de ces programmes. I have been told that there have been some challenges in the translation when I've been speaking because my settings were not quite right. But just to summarize, therefore, what I was saying, that the Dr. Dahoun, I think, has explained a lot of the challenges in terms of the continued financing of these programs. And usually, even when there are very good examples, there are gaps in terms of financing. And therefore, we're looking at ways in which we can further entrench these kinds of programs within, for example, national budgets as a means of expanding them and fully meeting the needs, because there's always a gap. If I can do a follow-up question with Eduardo, you have supported an initiative that builds capacity in improving food production supply chains through cold storage. And this is a key aspect as well of ensuring quality food systems value chains. So what opportunities are there to integrate renewable energy into such programs, specifically in the context of homegrown school feeding programs? I think Dr. Dahoun had spoken a little bit about the energy aspect, but from the context of clean cooking. And I think there's a very important aspect as well from the refrigeration and cold chain angle. And this, of course, links to the renewable energy dimension. I thank everyone also for the excellent comments in the chat, and we will come to them. I will bring those comments to the panelists in the next part. Please keep the comments coming. They are very good. Eduardo, over to you.
Thank you. I'll try to share my screen again, hopefully work. Yes, definitely. So when it comes to I saw some comments, the importance that it's not only feeding, but looking at more holistically of the entire value chain that comes into play within homegrown school feeding. And there's the aspect that, we've seen that is boosting local food systems. And when it comes to looking at, how do we ensure that, there's enough production, stable production, not only that can meet the demands of schools, but that can help contribute to food security down the line within the entire country. And what we witnessed in Kenya was that post-harvest losses were a major hindrance, and because they exceeded 40%, and especially for perishable produce like fruits and vegetables. And this is a very difficult issue that we need to find a way to counter. And a possible way that we tried and piloted in Kenya was through solar-powered cold chain storages. So to kind of work within the cold value chains and ensure that, smallholder farmers, cooperatives, and other actors within the local food systems have access to, those cold storage facilities, so that they can, store the produce, sell it at the right price, and ensure that, they can sustain themselves and there's no losses down the line. And, the principle around it being UNCDF is, as you can see, is not only working with other UN partners for the technical assistance, and, UNDP is a leader when it comes to, energy, renewable energy products, and by bringing in the financing instruments. And particularly when it comes to this solution, it's not as simple as the one before. We needed to provide a suite of instruments that may meet the demands, because there's different players that come into play. There's local financial institutions that need to provide the on-lending, the cold storage providers, as well as the smallholder farmers. And these three sets of stakeholders have different needs. Because when it comes to the local financial institutions, as I said before, they need an incentive to get into the business of a risky environment like cold storage or agriculture in general. And so with them, what we provided is a partial credit guarantee, so that, we cover it acts as an incentive, as a collateral to cover the risk to a certain extent, so that they can on-lend right now to cold storage service providers. Because the cold storage service providers, they need the liquidity in order to boost the production so that they can meet the demands of the various players, including farmers and cooperatives, cold storage units. And in that, though, we saw that, there's not only the need to support local financial institutions, but in certain instances for those suppliers that are larger. And, we also included in the suite of financing tools the possibility of provide direct loans to those cold storage providers so that they can have access to that liquidity that we talked about, so that they can boost the production of these cold storage units. And lastly, it's important also, given the specificities of the agriculture sector, the seasonality, the difficulties, how exogenous shocks can hit smallholder farmers when it comes to their produce. The importance also, support them in case in case there's issues and there's delays in the repayments that they need to give to cold storage providers in order to have those cold storage units available within their storage. So, and that's where we may provide what we call reimbursable grants in shortened terms, so that they can, through the tariff support facility, so they can, in the meantime, the small delay that they can face in order for the repayments, they can, meet the demands of the cold storage providers. So here, what we see is a really a way, like a very comprehensive example with all of the different instruments that we can use in order to boost affordable financing to various players in those markets. And what we truly believe, given the specificities, as well as the fact that it involves farmers, it involves local financial institutions, it involves renewable energy providers, we believe that this could be an example and that could be replicated in other areas within the continent, that we did other homegrown school feeding programs within the continent to see energy, as you said, Jean-Paul, beyond the cook stoves that may occur within the canteen in the schools themselves, but really to help boost up renewable energy solutions for the smallholder farmers themselves, for other actors within the value chain of homegrown school feeding. Thanks.
No, thank you so much. And you have started to answer a little bit this angle of how we can use homegrown school feeding programs to contribute to economic growth and sustainable development through the anchoring around local food systems. To further elaborate on that part of the discussion, I would like to invite Dr. Robert Akatia-Arma, who has commented in the chat. I think he made an excellent comment in the chat. And I know he works with the World Food Programme. So it'd be great to hear from you, Dr. Robert, if you're able to take the floor to share a little bit some of your perspectives on these, how we build that integrated value chain of production for economic growth through an agri-food system. Dr. Robert, are you able to take the floor?
Can you hear me? Can you confirm if you can hear me?
We hear you perfectly.
Great. Okay. So yes, so the comment I made is because, homegrown school feeding, as I said, it's not just about feeding kids. It goes way beyond that, from the concept of production to consumption. But within that chain, there are many, many opportunities for economic growth, as well as development. And most of the players along that value chain can actually contribute to it. So if you look at homegrown school feeding from the perspective of economic development, but also a value chain, and even through a policy framework, there are many, many opportunities that it creates. So let's just start from that whole concept around local production and local systems. it does provide significant opportunities for engagement with farmers, not just around production systems, but also gives opportunities for private sector engagement. It provides opportunities for seed multipliers. It provides opportunities for training and capacity strengthening. It provides opportunities for agricultural and extension services. And so there are many things that can come out of that that all have an economic value that governments can look at in terms of these activities creating opportunities in themselves from the supply side. Schools themselves, as just mentioned by a colleague from UNSDCF, provides a platform for integrating several programs, from nutrition to health, to clean cooking, to energy investments, to clean energies. There's so many areas where schools themselves can become a platform for training, but also some of these areas that I've mentioned. And climate related investments are becoming more and more critical as we begin to look at schools as the places for these types of investments through a homegrown school feeding approach. It does also provide lots of opportunities for strengthening food security, for strengthening educational outcomes, as we've talked about. Oftentimes when we talk about school feeding programs, there's a lot of focus mostly on the educational outcomes without necessarily looking at some of the investments. And one of the areas that we usually don't look at is the feeding part and how feeding is contributing to educational outcomes. So homegrown school feeding in itself as a module provides many opportunities around that. Now, in terms of where the different actions come in and the different modalities, going from procurement and whether these are managed by organizations like WFP, FAO, CDF, and so on, do create opportunities and platform for system strengthening and capacity building. I'm based in Ethiopia right now, and some of the work that we're doing with government around introduction of homegrown school feeding into the government school feeding programming is really capacitating local regional governments to be able, sorry, okay, someone asked for a video, so I'm gonna try to.
Oh, but we've lost your voice now with the video.
Okay.
Now it's perfect. Now we can see you and hear you. Perfect.
Sure. So we're building the capacity of local and regional governments to be able to learn how to do homegrown school feeding by themselves, right? So we're transferring, instead of WFP buying the food and giving it to the schools as we've done in our traditional school feeding programs, we're now transferring these resources to schools. The schools themselves at the regional levels are contracting farmers, and they're ensuring that they're integrating many different aspects, including crop insurance, for example. This is encouraging farmers to produce, and this is contributing to climate risk. So farmers are no longer scared to produce because of climate or changing weather patterns, because there's an insurance component to it. And this is opening up businesses themselves. There is logistics involved in homegrown school feeding, transportation. So there are many, many ways in which homegrown school feeding as a concept, rather than just school feeding, provides and opens up economic opportunities that allows investments both in the private sector, in national systems around capacity and strengthening of systems, but also the educational outcomes that we're looking at. If we're going to be talking about human capital development and the investments that countries need for future investment, we need to look at homegrown school feeding along the portfolio, right from early childhood education to primary school to adolescent education. All of these places are touch points along the homegrown school feeding spectrum that allows countries and economies to develop. So if we can look at homegrown school feeding as a value chain, I think we can then see where the many opportunities come in, both from the economic, from the development, and then also from the human-centered side. Back to you, Jean. Thank
you, Dr. Robert, for these excellent perspectives, and also for bringing in your very significant experience in the World Food Programme and the specific example of Ethiopia. And we apologize to everyone that Karen could not join us, but I think it has been very good to hear from Dr. Robert. I'd now like to address some of the gender components. And Matodi Malope has made two excellent comments. Matodi, if you can take the floor to perhaps further elaborate on your question. I think you had asked if Dr. Dahoun could further elaborate on how school feeding plays a role in gender equality and attendance for both the girls and the boy child. Dr. Dahoun, je viendrai vers vous pour élaborer un peu sur cette question de genre vis-à-vis la participation égalitaire de genre dans le système éducatif à travers des programmes d'alimentation scolaire. But Matodi, if we could go to you to perhaps reflect on that question, and I think you also had you made a point about, in addition to, or as an alternative to cold storage, whether agro-processing has been considered. Maybe you'd like to reflect on that if you're able to take the floor.
Yes, Chair, thank you so much for the opportunity. I will start with the agro-processing one and just share some insight as to what we do in South Africa in particular, Gauteng province where I'm working. Though I am in communications, what we do some kind of awareness and marketing as well for our agriculture experts. What that has done, we also use our farmers that we support, also use school gardens and other community facilities to establish food gardens that they also sell during those market days. That is part of marketing and economic development as well. But in the process, learners as well get involved in the actual establishment of food gardens. We also have competitions where we inspire and encourage children to participate in food security programs. One other thing that we do is that we have experts who also assist, including other stakeholders who assist the farmers themselves and those who are interested in agro-processing to create longevity for the fresh produce, so that what they sell doesn't necessarily diminish because of lack of storage. So those are some of the practicalities that the department has taken, and I'm really going to limit this to the department that I work for. And we find that very helpful because it doesn't then mean that there is waste in the process of the value chain. And it includes both girl and boy child for both competitions, but also during these market days as well. But what we have done is even go beyond the food production thing to say, if this is about economic activity, maybe we need to even broaden the scope by including other economic activities to demonstrate that people can do these things for themselves. So that is part of agro-processing. And what also we do is collaborate with other departments, for instance, to raise awareness. Eduardo spoke about financial literacy. So we will then elaborate with the Department of Economic Development so that people learn about tax compliance, so that they can even get into the value chain of being the providers, because they will then be compliant in all other laws that enables them to be economically active. And the other part was about really gender equality, because Dr. Dahoun indicated that because of the school feeding programs, they have seen excellent participation, school attendance of both the girl and the boy child. And what I found very interesting was it really just about participation itself, or was it about awareness on the integration of addressing the gender divide in food production, instead of looking at it as a mainstream woman role, for instance. When it comes together, and suppose there is a backyard food garden, or there is a feeding scheme, how are both genders or all genders involved in harmonizing that divide that we know still exists? Thank you.
Well, thank you, Matodi, for sharing these perspectives on agro-processing, in particular, I think also the South Africa perspective. Dr. Dahoun, si je peux revenir vers vous pour répondre un peu à la question autour du genre. Et j'espère que vous avez pu suivre la question, que plus ou moins d'élaborer comment les programmes d'alimentation scolaire ont aidé à faciliter la participation de jeunes filles autant que garçons. Et est-ce que, je crois que la question aussi, c'est est-ce que ça a augmenté, ça a facilité la conscience aussi de l'importance de la participation ou de l'éducation des filles. Et peut-être que vous pouvez partager un peu davantage sur ces stratégies. Votre micro n'est toujours pas activé.
Alors,
Voilà, parfait.
la première chose que je voudrais dire, c'est que quand il y a des enfants déscolarisés ou des enfants en âge d'être scolarisés qui sont à la maison, c'est beaucoup plus un poids pour la mère que pour le père. Parce que le père s'en va, c'est la mère qui s'occupe, qui va s'arranger pour trouver à manger à ses enfants à midi. Alors, l'une des grandes réussites du programme alimentaire, c'est que beaucoup de mamans nous ont témoigné que pendant 5 jours de la semaine, du lundi à vendredi, ils sont plus libres pour s'occuper à leurs occupations, pour aller faire leurs activités, parce que les enfants sont à l'école et le repas est garanti. Voilà déjà un aspect. Donc, les mères disent, mais les enfants même, on les dépose à l'école du lundi à mardi, je n'ai pas de souci à me faire. Au Bénin, comme je vous ai dit, la participation des écoliers, c'est 25 francs. Une mère a dit qu'elle a 4 enfants dans l'école, ça lui fait 100 francs dans la journée. Ça lui fait 500 francs en semaine. Elle dit qu'elle fait tout pour avoir les 500 francs parce que c'est très important pour elle. Donc, la femme est beaucoup plus libérée et s'occupe d'autres activités. Alors, voilà. L'autre chose, dans les écoles, nous avons comparé les listes de présence, c'est-à-dire que les présences et les abandons pendant une année et pendant l'année avant l'introduction de la cantine scolaire. Et on a remarqué qu'il y a beaucoup plus de présence de filles. Donc, il y a beaucoup plus de présence de filles pendant la cantine. Et, chose curieuse, les directeurs d'école nous ont confié que quand les filles viennent et qu'il y a à manger, garçons, bon, ça va, c'est à rechercher, mais de façon empirique, pendant les enquêtes, voilà ce que nous avons vu sur le terrain, qu'il y a quand même un impact très positif sur les filles et sur les résultats des filles par rapport aux résultats des garçons. Voilà 2 éléments quand même que je peux partager pour montrer que de façon claire, on sent un impact. Et par le passé aussi, il y a beaucoup de grossesses précoces ou des abandons où les mamans et les papas aussi qui parfois sont obligés de partir au champ avec les enfants ou la maman va au marché avec les enfants. Quand il y a la cantine, ils savent que les enfants vont à l'école, ils n'ont plus rien à voir. C'est le soir qu'ils vont essayer de voir ce qu'ils vont manger. Donc, dans la journée, ils sont plus libérés et la femme est beaucoup plus dégagée pour s'occuper de ses activités.
Merci.
Quand même qu'il y a un impact véritable sur les femmes, sur les jeunes filles, sur leurs résultats et sur la rétention à l'école.
Excellent. Merci beaucoup, Dr. Dahoun. Très clair. Et comme vous avez dit, il y a des données qui démontrent cette amélioration. Je note aussi un commentaire de Dr. Robert dans le chat qui dit que de l'autre côté aussi, au côté de la production alimentaire, beaucoup des agriculteurs, surtout sur à petite échelle, sont des femmes. Alors, en fait, il y a des bénéfices de deux côtés.
La connexion n'est pas très...
La connexion n'est pas très bonne, pardon. But just to say that I'm just drawing attention to Dr. Roberts' also comment that the gender dimension is also at the level of production for the smallholder producer. If we can cover a few other points, I think there is a question that came from Pezu Mukwakwa. Pezu, if you would like to take the floor, we have covered some elements of your question because there were many questions. But if you would like to take the floor, we can give you the floor. Vous avez posé votre question en français. Si vous voulez prendre la parole, monsieur ou madame Pezu Mukwakwa, vous êtes le bienvenu. Et je crois que surtout la partie qu'on n'a pas encore répondu, c'est comment est-ce qu'on peut adresser les défis liés au programme alimentaire scolaire, surtout dans des régions qui sont dans des contextes fragiles ou post-conflit? Pezo, would you like to take the floor?
Hi, Jean-Paul. No, it's fine. I think my question was touched on from the different responses, so I'm fine. Thank you.
Okay, very good. I also noted the question from Lashea that in many countries you have a very long school holidays, and therefore does other programs impact then diminished during those periods? So I will go to you, Eduardo, to reflect a little bit on some of these questions, particularly about the one on post-conflict or in conflict. So a lot of the programs, a lot of the ideas that you've mentioned, perhaps are harder to implement in those contexts. Can you reflect a little bit on how we can address this even in a, let's say, a fragile or conflict scenario? Et je reviendrai vers vous, Dr. Daoun, pour vos réflexions en ce sens aussi. Eduardo.
Okay, thanks so much, Jean-Paul. Yeah, I'm going to touch upon both from UNCDF side as well as WFP side, because before joining UNCDF, I was actually working in post-conflict and conflict settings with WFP in Nigeria and Liberia. So maybe that could help as well. Yeah, definitely. I think, you know, there's not much difference in terms of the perception of risk from local financial institutions and market players in general. I think, you know, especially because what we should aim towards is really to ensure the build-up of local financial ecosystems. So the issue when it comes to, you know, fragile settings, conflict, post-conflict settings is more around how do we incentivize external capital? So like, you know, capital markets or international capital to come in to those countries, especially from the private sector. But eventually, the main elements around you know, what's needed is really to how do we build the credibility, how do we build the present demonstration effects on the bankability of these projects so that we can attract private capital down the line. Of course, when it comes to fragile settings, there's an additional layer that we need to think about. Which is basically ensuring that whatever intervention that we bring forth brings about peace dividends. So when it comes to bringing, like, looking at the entire value chain, especially when touching upon and discussing with some of the farmers, cooperatives, how to decide what kind of produce, what we should be investing in. And the work that we do, especially in terms of how do we build a business case for them to then access even the already de-risked kind of financial products that we help develop with local financial institutions. And that's a little bit of work that we do as part of the UN family in what we call the community development participatory planning processes, so that we bring about all the different civil society representatives, women-led businesses, etc., to decide how do we go forth and how do we develop a business plan that may work within the specificities of this context. And you'd be surprised that, you know, what we witnessed, not only in terms of guarantees, or not only in terms of what we discussed, but also in issuing bonds, you know, they have worked in a fragile context and they've come about more successfully than in more traditional, more like it's what may be perceived as stable markets. Because, you know, there's less competition, so to speak. There's less, you know, verve to get on and to try it. The many hesitancy because simply there's not enough info. There's not enough successful examples. There's not enough, you know, discussions and lessons learned, as well as, you know, South-South kind of exchanges. And I think this kind of webinars would help to see that, you know, these kind of instruments, even these types of affordable financing mechanisms can really work. And, you know, we have example as part of UNCDF in Tanzania that, you know, we issued a subnational water bond. And when we talk to our partners of, like, you know, private sector, private financiers here in New York, where I'm based, was like, yeah, you're crazy. Like, no, it will never work. And then what happens was that it actually got oversubscribed, and 65% was from the oversubscription came from national stakeholders, national capital. So see, especially both in fragile context, both in conflict, post-conflict, it's really important to build the local financial ecosystem and to ensure that give it a try and use those sustainable financing mechanisms that I've talked about to ensure that we can bring about those demonstration effects. We can show that it works. And particularly for this Tanzania case, what happened was that, a few weeks ago, it got listed in the Luxembourg Stock Exchange, the same bond. So you see, it's also a way to really look at how do we, with this, scarce means and scarce public capital that we may have, how can we leverage it, not only to showcase that these things work, but also to crowd in private capital. And it's a process. You cannot expect that private capital, even within the homegrown school feeding, is gonna, tailor to the needs in its entirety. But, it's a step towards the right direction of, creating sustainability and creating country ownership down the line among all actors.
Thank you, Eduardo. I think a fantastic reflection. And in particular, we should not just think that because a country faces a conflict, that the world stops in that country, because people are living there. And the point you made that 65% of the subscribers came from within the country, if I got you right. And because people remain engaged, no matter how challenging the local situation is, people will still be wanting to find, to develop processes that allow some resilience to take place. And I think there's a link there potentially as well with remittances, because you also have, even in areas where there is conflict, you have populations that may have been displaced, but will continue to support local populations that could not move away, and will want ways to do so through infrastructures and through programs such as school feeding. So I think these are things that we should not discount. I think we have unfortunately temporarily lost Dr. Dahoun, but I'd like to go to Dr. Robert, who I think, Dr. Dahoun, vous êtes de retour. Pardon, je croyais qu'on vous avait perdu parce que je vous ai pas vu.
Oui, j'avais un problème de connexion, mais c'est bon maintenant.
C'est bon, parfait. Non, je voulais peut-être demander vos réflexions aussi sur les programmes de alimentation scolaire dans les zones affectées par le conflit et comment est-ce que c'est faisable et nécessaire et comment les adresser. Et je ne sais pas si vous avez aussi des réflexions autour de la question de pendant les vacances scolaires. Parce que souvent, on crée un programme qui est très sollicité et vous avez vous-même parlé des exemples, comment sont appréciés par les foyers. Mais pendant la période des vacances, est-ce qu'il y a maintenant un problème qui se pose? Peut-être vous pouvez répondre ces deux éléments. And after that, I would just like to go to Dr. Robert, who I think can also bring a WFP perspective to these questions. Dr. Dahoun.
Oui, comme je vous le disais, c'est un programme qui est très apprécié. Donc, quand les vacances arrivent, c'est parfois un souci pour certains parents et même pour certains élèves, parce que quand ils sont à la maison, quand ils ne sont pas au cours, le repas ne vient pas à temps, ou ça met du temps avant de venir. Certaines personnes, c'est jusqu'à 17 heures qu'il va avoir le premier repas dans la journée, alors que quand il va à l'école, à 12 heures, le repas est là. Donc, donc, on sent même que pendant que la rentrée s'approche, dans les zones rurales où vraiment il y a des difficultés, les enfants, leur point focal, c'est le repas. Donc, pendant les vacances, c'est une grande difficulté, surtout pour certains parents. Mais certains amènent leurs enfants au champ, carrément, qui restent avec eux dans le champ. Et donc, c'est un problème pendant les vacances. Maintenant, dans les zones de conflit, c'est un grand problème parce que ceux qui doivent donner le repas aussi doivent rechercher la sécurité. Donc, les repas ne peuvent être donnés que dans des zones qui sont sécurisés. C'est-à-dire qu'on ne peut pas prendre le risque d'aller dans des endroits où il y a des risques de conflit. Donc, ça limite la possibilité de donner des repas, parce que s'il y a des zones qui sont déjà occupées par les rebelles et autres, ces zones ne peuvent pas avoir accès, ne peuvent pas avoir de repas. Donc, ça fait qu'il peut y avoir des gens qui vont vouloir fuir et venir du côté où il y a la sécurité, la zone qui est sécurisée. Donc, les zones, c'est seulement les zones qui sont sécurisées qui peuvent être servies. C'est là qu'il peut y avoir le repas. Mais les zones qui ne sont pas sécurisées, c'est la débandade, tout le monde va dans tous les sens et on ne peut même pas avoir la tête tranquille pour dire qu'on peut préparer aux enfants.
Merci beaucoup, Dr. Daoun. Et c'était intéressant pour moi que vous avez expliqué que, par exemple, dans des zones où il y a des conflits, oui, parfois dans les médias, c'est pas possible parce que si la zone n'est pas sécurisée, il n'y a pas de programme. Mais vous avez des gens parfois qui justement partent dans des zones où ces programmes sont disponibles, se déplacent, qui démontrent aussi l'importance de ces programmes vis-à-vis la résilience. Can I go to Dr. Robert again, and maybe you can share with us a little bit some reflections on this question of resilience in conflict-affected states, and also addressing the challenge of school holidays and how to provide that support.
Yep. Okay. So let's start with conflict-affected places. So generally, I mean, these, as has been said by my colleague, Dr. Dahoun, it's quite difficult to provide ongoing school programming in these areas. However, we do have what we call school feeding in emergencies that allows, for example, if different actors and different partners come together, it allows us to be able to tag on to other different programs and activities that are being developed or implemented by other partners. In the past, and not just emergencies, but even when we have shocks, and I'm going to go back and reflect a little bit on when we had COVID. So COVID, schools were completely shut, kids were at home, access was quite difficult. However, WFP continued to be able to support governments implement school feeding programs, including homegrown school feeding programs. And the way this was done was really ensuring that there was strong coordination among partners and trying to layer programs together. So anywhere, for example, where UNICEF was taking educational materials in small groups across the many different communities, WFP could provide a take-home ration. WFP could organize a take-home ration session where food will be provided for several weeks for households, and then these mothers then could cook food within those contexts. So where context is a bit fragile but relatively stable, people can provide that. Now, if it's absolutely impossible, like in certain contexts in Sudan, where people are constantly on the move, for example, emergency school feeding programs allow feeding times in very specific locations where children can group together and get some food, or school feeding programs then get integrated into general food assistance programs to allow these types of programs to be implemented. Because oftentimes in conflict zones, what happens even with schools is that you have a lot of state and non-state actors using schools as their places for fighting and staying, and so schools themselves become displaced. But this is where community engagement is critical. And community engagement, when you are implementing homegrown school feeding, allowing the communities to buy into that concept right from the beginning, but also integrating the possibilities of shock responsiveness in school feeding, creates platforms for you to be able to respond rapidly, because you would have already built a network within these communities. And as they move, you're able to still communicate and figure out a way to provide assistance to make sure that there is. So providing school feeding or even homegrown school feeding approaches, right from procurement to the logistics to the distribution in itself, during conflict requires strong community engagement, requires strong community advocacy, but also a lot of partner support coming in to support. I will post a couple of resources in the chat for colleagues to read through for those who are interested. And one of them is really focused on the legislation change and financing futures around some of these ECOWAS homegrown school feeding approaches, but also 1 or 2 documents around conflicts and school feeding in emergencies. Over.
Thank you so much, Dr. Robert, for these perspectives, and thank you for sharing in the chat any additional information. I know some other colleagues have also shared. My colleague Darlington Trumer has shared a policy brief from the Office of the Special Advisor on Africa. Dr. Robert had already shared some WFP publications, and I hope this will be useful for all participants. So I think where we are in terms of the discussion, we have seen how school feeding programs are a way of bringing together many strands of action that are related to the Sustainable Development Goals. They are also a type of intervention that is community-based. Dr. Robert just made that point, Dr. Dahun made that point, and also Eduardo. You are engaging in a form of empowerment of communities through school feeding. And therefore, it is not simply top-down, meaning that it is governments at the central level imposing it. It is a successful program depends on engagement, which is bottom-up, which empowers local actors. And this is one of the fundamental aspects in relation to assuring long-term peace and security. Because when you have a value chain which is truly community built, then there is more incentive to at least preserve the value chain that already exists. And I would like to now go a little bit onto the higher level, because we have talked about at the community level how this can be done. Dr. Dahun gave very good examples of how this is structured. But at the macroeconomic level, the national level, governments particularly African governments, are currently facing huge fiscal challenges. There is very little money available in budgets for discretionary additional spending. And the debt servicing costs have doubled since 2020 for African countries. So in that environment, it's very, very difficult for countries to mobilize additional financing. And the question is a little bit, where can we get this seed financing to start? There is work that is being undertaken, for example, on doing debt swaps, where countries could potentially swap a portion of their debt in return for using the savings for investing in school feeding programs as a means of attaining the Sustainable Development Goals. But I'd like to go to you, Eduardo, in terms of what are the perspectives at this very difficult time to get these off the ground in the first instance?
Yeah, thank you for this very difficult question. I don't have the magic wand, but I think there's different aspects. Let's try to break it down a little bit. I think first and foremost, you mentioned it, despite the fiscal pressures the national governments have, it's crucial that within the national budgets, there's a line on homegrown school feeding. That even if it's a little, it's an incentive to crowd in additional capital, especially from the public sector. I think, again, it's not only for homegrown school feedings, but for the entire SDGs. The SDGs cannot be achieved only through public capital or ODA. We need to find ways to bring in the private capital, not only domestically, but also internationally. So we need to, I think homegrown school feeding could really be a program, given its multifaceted nature and the fact that it really brings in not only all the SDGs, but also a myriad of actors within the value chain. We really need to find a way to leverage these public capital, the scarce public capital that we have, to crowd in private streams of finance. And I think you touched upon remittances. Remittances are a huge source of foreign direct investments in those in most countries in Africa. And what we need to see is how can we leverage those to support these kind of programs that have these different values across the value chain and in different sectors. And on the other hand, how do we unlock domestic capital that is available. Because it's true, you know, the debt burden on most countries is insurmountable. There's lots of work that is being done, you know, both as UN, but also among partners within the international community as a whole, to find ways through debt swaps and through other means to limit, you know, the pressure on national governments regarding debt servicing. But we need to try and find a way, how do we unlock what's present in country, and how do we use that to then crowd in private capital, because it's very difficult and utopic somewhat to simply think that, you know, private capital from international capital markets is gonna come without a level of de-risking that we talked about. And this is not because there's no value in what's been done, but it's really because they simply do not know. And I think us as development practitioners, we need to do a better job of, you know, not only garnering information, but also publicizing it in a way that speaks to the various audiences. I think, you know, public capital and other, like, you know, de-risking kind of spots of capital may come from philanthropies, may come from individuals, and WFP has been a leader in the garnering you know, individual giving for school feeding, for other emergency programs around the world. So how do we work as a system to ensure that these scarce public capital can actually catalyze the additional sources from the private?
Thank you. That's perfect. I think that we acknowledge all of the challenges, but it is necessary that we, even when it appears very difficult, that we are building domestic aspects and deepening of the opportunity for domestic finance, and using whatever small amount you have to then leverage larger amounts and looking at the return on investment. This is not a cost. It is something which unlocks other things. And Dr. Dahoun had previously spoken about just the fact that, let's say, currently in many countries, women are at home. If the children are not at school, their time is completely taken up in that. School feeding allows the children to be at school. It liberates them to do other economic activities, which has a growth value for the economy. And when you add all those small interventions together, it can be quite consequential. And I would also invite people to look at what Brazil has done through their programs, which I think is the largest school feeding program, if I'm not mistaken, in the world. And it has, they also have some challenges, but it is a successful example that has linked this social aspect with the economic development aspect. Dr. Dahoun, je reviens vers vous juste pour terminer un peu les interventions. Et selon votre appréciation, quels sont les facteurs les plus importants qui permettent de mettre en place un programme d'alimentation scolaire qui a un vrai impact? Quelles sont les actions nécessaires de la part des gouvernements qui permettent vraiment à démarrer un tel programme?
Alors, si je dois prendre le modèle béninois qui est en cours là, je l'ai expliqué tout à l'heure, il y a les grosses dépenses qui sont prises en charge par le PAM, le gouvernement et les partenaires financiers. Mais les petites dépenses, c'est les communautés elles-mêmes qui l'apportent. Et ça, c'est une très bonne expérience parce que ça permet aux communautés de se mettre dans la danse. Le résultat n'est pas totalement bon encore, mais il y a des îlots de réussite qu'on voit. Donc, la chance, c'est là, parce qu'il faut que les communautés elles-mêmes prennent conscience qu'ils ne doivent pas toujours avoir des aides qui vont venir d'ailleurs. Donc, il faut, et je peux vous dire que grâce à l'alimentation scolaire, par exemple, on peut remarquer qu'il y a eu la cohésion sociale qui commence par naître. Par exemple, il y a des écoles dans lesquelles il y a les APE, Association des parents d'élèves, qui n'est pas du tout actif. Mais les directeurs d'école ont confié que depuis que la cantine est venue, Ces parents se retrouvent pour parler des 25 francs qu'il faut donner aux enfants, comment il faut faire pour que ça soit beaucoup plus collecté. Ces parents commencent par discuter des jardins, comment il faut faire pour que les jardins d'école soient bien. Donc, c'est un sujet qui commence par rassembler quand même les communautés et qui crée une certaine cohésion sociale. Donc, lorsque on veut mettre en place des programmes d'alimentation scolaire, il ne faudrait pas que tout le financement soit fait. Il faut que les communautés, qu'on délègue aux communautés une partie qui leur revient et qu'il y ait cette synergie entre les gros efforts et des efforts au niveau des communautés pour que les communautés apprennent lentement à se mettre dans le jeu. Et dans l'espoir qu'on peut finir complètement par déléguer. Alors, nous parlons de l'alimentation scolaire basée sur les produits locaux. Alors, aujourd'hui, au Bénin, c'est l'objectif qui est fait, mais la grosse partie des achats se font au niveau national parce que le local n'est pas encore complètement prêt. Parce que quand le local sera prêt, il y aura une régionalisation des approvisionnements. C'est-à-dire qu'on va approvisionner dans chaque région où les paysans de chaque localité vont pouvoir approvisionner les écoles de leur localité. On n'est pas encore à cette étape-là, mais ça viendra. Ça viendra. Donc, il faut avoir en vue que l'objectif final, c'est de régionaliser pour que chaque région puisse être autonome pour pouvoir approvisionner les écoles. Mais au départ, il faut quand même que chaque midi, les enfants mangent. Donc, en attendant de pallier à cela, le PAM et le gouvernement s'activent, essayent de tout faire pour pouvoir mettre en place une logistique pour que les repas soient disponibilisés dans les écoles et qu'à 12h00, les enfants mangent. Mais en même temps, il faut actionner le volet communautaire. Et au Bénin, il y a des ONG qui sont recrutées, qui travaillent dans toutes les communautés pour sensibiliser les parents, pour sensibiliser la mairie, c'est-à-dire que la municipalité, pour sensibiliser les acteurs privés qui sont dans ces communautés pour qu'ils prennent au sérieux cette activité. Comme on l'a dit, il y a par exemple des écoles qui ne sont pas accessibles. Mais pour pouvoir disponibiliser les repas, on a été obligé de construire des voies et des pistes rurales. Donc, ces pistes rurales n'ont été construites que parce qu'il y a eu la cantine qui est arrivée, il y a eu l'alimentation scolaire qui est arrivée. Donc, comme je le dis, pour pouvoir réussir cela, il faut forcément penser aux gros moyens, mais impliquer les communautés à la base pour qu'ils comprennent que, en fait, en dernière instance, c'est leur activité. Ils doivent comprendre que c'est à eux de donner à manger à leurs enfants. Et donc, le fait de suppléer et d'apporter à manger à leurs enfants, ils doivent comprendre qu'ils ont leur part de responsabilité dans cette activité.
Merci. Merci beaucoup, Dr. Dahoun. Et je crois que vous avez très bien expliqué l'importance de cette cohérence entre une politique gouvernementale et une appropriation au niveau de la communauté. Et qu'en fait, il faut ce partage de volonté, mais aussi de penser à une mobilisation des ressources, pas seulement au niveau gouvernemental, mais aussi au niveau communautaire.
Du secteur privé.
Et la coordination entre ces opérateurs permet en fait de faire une opération très conséquente avec une valeur ajoutée qui est plus large aussi et potentiellement même à une valeur économique très forte pour le pays. I think we are reaching now the point of concluding our webinar because I have a few comments that I need to make at the end in terms of the conclusion of our series of webinars, and which requires about 10 minutes. So I would like at this point to thank Dr. Dahoun and Eduardo. Thank you to you both. I think your interventions have been really fantastic. I'd also like to thank the impromptu participation of Dr. Robert, who I think has really, Dr. Robert Akatiama, who has really given us some fantastic perspectives from the World Food Programme. And I'd also like to thank all those who have contributed with their comments and questions in the chat, which has enriched our discussion. And I hope that through today's discussion, we have seen the linkage between community-based school feeding programs, which have a high impact on local populations, which are situated within government programs, and which potentially can be leveraged for developing agro systems, which are also an opportunity, therefore, to leverage financial systems, which have potentially national impact if scaled at the right level. We did touch very briefly on the issues of, for example, using digital technologies as well. And Eduardo and I had talked a little bit about remittances. And I think there is a huge opportunity there around digital technologies, recognizing that many of these smallholder farmers may have limited access to traditional banking, but they may have access to mobile banking. And there is an opportunity to unlock this ecosystem of finance at the community level, but which, if sustained, can very much lead to a much bigger impact. And perhaps the statistic that I will leave you with, which is from the World Food Programme, and there are varying returns on investment in different countries, but in some cases can be as high as $9 for every $1 invested. I think in the Benin and Rwanda examples, the return on investment was $5 for every $1, but in some cases it is as high as $9. But even at $5 return for $1, there are very few interventions that provide that level of return on investment. And I think that that is the crux of school feeding programs, is that they are programs which have a high impact for populations, but actually do provide a very, very significant economic impact, and if scaled, can truly be transformative. I would now like to just do a short recap of the work we have done so far through our various webinars and look ahead to the next steps. So today's session highlighted the potential for homegrown school feeding programs as policy tools for driving sustainable development across multiple sectors. And the discussion underscored this importance of policy integration and local empowerment. And there is a wealth of information that has been provided by the various partners. So we encourage all of the participants to continue the discussion on the course platform and apply the insights gained today as you continue working on your final essays. And this brings us to the end of our webinar series for OSAA's online course. And I will summarize some of the key messages from the webinars linked to each of the course modules. Firstly, to recap the Nexus framework, throughout this course, we've explored the critical interdependencies between durable peace, sustainable development, sustainable financing, and effective governance. Each module builds upon the last, illustrating how these elements are not standalone, but rather interconnected components of holistic approach to development. And that is the essence of the Peace and Development Nexus. Secondly, we want to make sure that there has been the link between peace and development is clear. And I think, as has come out even in today's discussion, it's not a question of waiting for peace for development. Development has to be happening at the same time that peace is happening. And as highlighted in Module 1, sustainable development is foundational for achieving lasting peace. We discussed how interconnected issues of sustainable development, governance, and peace building are, and how addressing the root causes of conflict through development can lead to more resilient societies. We also concluded that the absence of the state is a primary root cause of conflict. Module 2 was addressing financing for sustainability and emphasized the need for predictable access to sustainable financing. We explored the triple paradox, whereby Africa has large resources, both in terms of financing, agriculture, and energy, but however, these resources are too often not mobilized. But we discussed the actionable strategies for improving domestic financial systems, fostering trust in governance, and implementing sectoral reforms in energy and agriculture and food systems. We identified the criticality of institutions as enablers and domestic resource mobilization as being a game changer, with energy as a driver to unlock food systems transformation on the continent. In Module 3, we emphasize the importance of controlling economic and financial flows as a cornerstone of sustainable financing. We examined strategies to curb illicit financial flows, enhance public finance management, and explore alternative financing mechanisms such as carbon markets, and also unlocking investments from pension funds across the African continent. And we also did discuss briefly some other types of innovative financing, such as debt swaps, as means of mobilizing very urgent need for financing across the African continent, and recognizing the increased stress represented by higher cost of debt servicing. Module 4 underscored the importance of robust institutions and governance in managing Africa's debt challenges and achieving sustainable development. We explored strategies to enhance transparency through digital public infrastructure, the strengthening of domestic resource mobilization, and promoting policy cohesion across all sectors. And we have concluded today in Module 5 with the goal being of looking at the theories of sustainable development in practice, with school feeding programs as a very practical example of translating the theory of the Peace and Development Nexus into practice. And we have hoped in today's session to integrate the lessons from all of the modules, looking at how homegrown school feeding programs can not only improve immediate educational and nutritional needs, but also lay the groundwork for long-term sustainable development. Healthier, better educated children are more likely to contribute positively to their communities. Increased state presence is more likely to build trust in institutions and governments, and more robust and resilient local food systems and livelihoods build value chains that can underpin economic opportunities. Renewable and off-grid energy solutions can enable climate adaptation, and sustainable domestically driven financing to support such systems create fiscal and policy space for countries to direct their own development planning. And together they can foster a cycle of peace and development. And then this brings us back to the first element of our course. So as we conclude, I encourage each of you to take these insights back to your respective countries, ministries, organizations, and in your daily activities, and consider how you can advocate for and implement policies that leverage the interlinkages we've discussed to create resilient, sustainable systems in your countries. And we also want to encourage all of you to help us build a community of practice through this course so that we can continue to promote and engage Africa's development potential. In the Office of the Special Advisor on Africa, and particularly our Under Secretary General, she has often said that the Africa we want is the Africa that the world needs. And this recognizes that development in itself is currently challenged because we face an unprecedented era of geopolitical tension. Multilateralism is challenged, and the key to unlocking all of this is actually a successful Africa, because if Africa grows at the right level with Africa's demographics, it will actually create a new wave of global prosperity. And therefore, we are not asking for charity for Africa. And I think that's very much one of the key drivers of the narrative of this these series of webinars. But it is rather that a successful Africa will provide a dynamic that helps the whole world and will drive global growth and global prosperity, and therefore accelerate the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. I thank once again the United Nations System Staff College, who have very much facilitated our work. I thank all of the speakers, all of the panelists, and all those who have contributed in lectures, but most of all the participants, and we hope that this has been extremely useful for all of you. Wishing you all a very good afternoon, a good evening, and good day. And thank you very much, and all best wishes from New York. Thank you very much.